Good morning and welcome to History of Interiors. Today we will be discussing the early Christian style. As you can see, this is the second period of the Middle Ages that we will study, and it goes from 330 to 800 CE. Generally speaking, we can regard the early Christian style as connected to Western Europe, where the Byzantine style was connected to Eastern Europe. And in this lecture, we will discuss the architectural and artistic styles popularized during the early Christian time period. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, the early Christian architecture is being developed at the same time that the Byzantine style is first being created. However, the scene for the Byzantine style is going to be in that Eastern Europe, Constantinople area near Turkey, whereas the early Christians are going to take root in Italy. So right where the main center part of the Roman Empire was, they're going to take over all of that Western Roman Empire, but be centrally located in Italy. And then, due to the context of everything that was going on at the time, so there was a lot of political and social discord that was happening. Obviously, the Roman Empire just split, everything was kind of falling apart around them. Early Christians felt the need to build everything very quickly. This would help to establish Christian dominance in the area by making sure that they had as many buildings and as many nice buildings as they possibly could. They were really helping themselves to create a strong starting point to grow their religion from. And then, oftentimes, as a means of exerting dominance and as a means of using what was around them, they would use the architectural remnants from former temples. So, all of those Roman temples that we studied in our Roman time period, they would repurpose them into Christian churches. Moving on to early Christian architecture, most of these terms you should recognize from previous lectures. So we're going to see gabled roofs and basilica plans again today. And very few features that we'll see today are unique to early Christian architecture. We're going to see them throughout the Middle Ages. Most of them we'll see far beyond the Middle Ages, and we can see looking back past the Middle Ages. So to start, as I mentioned on the last slide, early Christians often had to rely on subpar building materials because they were trying to build so quickly, so they often used the wood that was available to them. However, this did leave them susceptible to invasions as the churches could be burned down really quickly. So while the wood might not have been the best option, though it was probably the best available to them for their churches, they did use some other things that really helped incorporate the environment around them and make their churches and buildings successful. So, as we saw with the Greeks, these are also people who are in an area with a lot of rainfall, so that gabled roof makes a really big comeback. So the gabled roof, remember, is just like a triangular shaped roof. It allows rain to run off of it very easily. It's pretty common what we think of when we think of a roof today. They also used clerestory windows for light, so those are going to be those windows that are elevated actually above our heads, well above eye level, and they just let in a really soft, kind of even light throughout. It would have also been great for airflow. The exterior of these buildings was not impressive, so there wasn't a lot going on. They're very simple on the outside. They're plain. There's nothing ornate to these churches that we will see become popular in the Renaissance and Baroque periods, where everything becomes really extravagant. These churches weren't that developed yet. However, just because they were plain on the outside doesn't mean that they were also equally as modest on the inside. The inside of these churches would have been highly decorated, and it would have tons of details. Lots of motifs will be seen. So yeah, there's kind of that juxtaposition there on the exterior and the interior, with the exterior being incredibly plain and the interior being heavily decorated. Um, and then the last feature of these churches is that they would feature a basilica plan. So we went over that in our Byzantine lecture, but I just want to remind you really quickly that there are five main elements to a basilica plan. So you have the nave, the aisle, the transept, the altar, and the apse. So that nave is going to be that central axis that goes along the long side of the cross. So if you were to draw like a T, it would be the stick that goes vertically. Um, and then the aisles would be kind of next to the nave. They would run alongside that. They're usually marked by a series of columns. The transept is going to be, once again, if you're drawing that T, the line that runs horizontally, so it actually crosses perpendicular to the nave. The altar is just where like religious ceremonies and such would take place, and then the apse is going to be back behind the altar towards the very top of that T shape. This is an image of one of those early Christian churches, and as you can see on the outside, there's very minimal decoration. It's quite plain, but you can see a lot of those architectural elements that I talked about on the last slide. So you can see that gabled roof, which is, like I said, just that triangular style roof, allows rain to run off of it really easily. And then you can also see those clerestory windows. So on that second and third tier, where you see the windows running along this side of the building, those would be clerestory windows. So like I said, they're not necessarily there for you to look out of, but they are there to let light filter in. As I've mentioned several times by now, the interiors of these churches were very different to the exterior design. They were far more ornate and extravagant than the exteriors, but they did have some features that we really haven't seen as much before, so I want to go over those with you. Um, they used flat coffered ceilings, which we talked about a little bit in Greece. They were certainly popular at places like the Parthenon, but these are flat and they usually have some type of pattern to them of like little squares that are recessed into the space. We'll see a picture of this on the next slide. Just like with the Byzantines, they were learning how to support walls, not to the same extreme that the Byzantines were by developing all of those extra buttresses, but they would have definitely had the technology to build buildings more than one story high. So we're starting to see a lot more 2 to 3 story, just multi-storied buildings become popularized during this time. And then, like I said, these were incredibly ornate, highly decorated. They used all of those Roman orders that were already popular during that time. And just to give you a little bit of context onto that, so when you're trying to establish a new religion, you want to tie it to something that already has longevity and is already seen as something that's very strong. So while the Roman religion was dying out, and I don't want to make it seem like the Roman religion was still going strong, they still wanted to be associated with something that was strong. So they turned to things like using those Roman orders that had so much power and everyone knew what they meant. And so by associating themselves with that idea, with that stronghold of Roman thought, they were able to really solidify their place in society, and that's kind of what helped the early Christian church survive. And so they also used a lot of marble floors and columns. They, like I said, wanted these interiors to be as nice as they possibly could be. And then lastly, these interiors of these churches were often the place that people would house their like really nice personal items. If it was something that meant a lot to them, they would put it inside the church because they believed that this would keep it safe from invasions from barbarians and others who were trying to threaten the church at that point in time. This slide shows an image of those interiors that we were talking about on the last slide. So you can now see that flat coffered ceiling right here. And this is looking through the nave down to where that altar would be. So you, like I said, have that coffered ceiling. You also have the arcade, which, if you'll remember, is that series of arches. These windows that you see up at the top, just below the coffered ceiling, are the clerestories. So, like I've said before, those clerestories allow a really soft light. So, you're not getting direct light, you're getting indirect light, but it would have reflected down and lit up the space with kind of an even wash of light. It also would have allowed air to pass through. Lastly, you have a spandrel, and this is something that we did not talk about on the last slide, but it's easier to understand if you can see it. So the spandrel is going to be the part of the ceiling that kind of forms a triangle, except the hypotenuse of the triangle is arched, that follows the arch of the like arcade that you can see here, or the arch that you can see at the end of the nave. So it's going to be the area, let me see if I can draw it really quickly. So the spandrel is going to be this area right here that connects the arch to the ceiling with a little piece of wall. So this is an image very similar to the one that we saw on the last slide, just looking right down the nave in that basilica plan church. And then you can see all of those same elements. So you still have the flat coffered ceiling, the arcades that run down the sides that would have signified where the aisle was in this church's floor plan. You have the clerestories above, which let some light in, and then you also have those spandrels above each of the arches. So the last thing to consider is the ornament that the early Christians would have used. And so, like I said before, they were trying to connect themselves to Rome as much as possible. You're getting that foundation that's going to be set for the Holy Roman Empire. So they're using a lot of those Roman temples. They're also using a lot of Roman motifs. So a lot of those anthemians and the animals that we studied that the Romans really revered, we're going to see a lot of those here as well. It's not uniquely Christian ornament that we're seeing arise. So it's not necessarily the idea of the crosses and all of that that we think of when we think of Christian ornament today. They were still very much using a lot of those Roman motifs throughout their spaces. And then lastly, they're also using a lot of color, so not necessarily to the degree of brightness that the Romans would have polychromed their buildings to, but definitely using color that's in those natural elements. There probably would have been paint on the walls to some degree, but remember that just because they had access to Carrara marble doesn't mean that that was the only type of marble that was being used, and marble is just a type of stone, so it actually comes in a wide variety of color, which is how we get so many colors into a lot of these buildings, especially on their flooring. So lastly, just to review, some things that you can do is look over these slides again. There will be a vocabulary list posted in your module, and I highly recommend you look over that because so much of what we're learning in this module, you're going to see time and time again, especially these basilica plans. Those are going to be incredibly important as we move forward into the Renaissance, which is what we will be discussing at the end of the Middle Ages. So like I said, that's an incredibly important thing to understand, so make sure you're looking over all of that. In terms of these slides versus the slides that we just went over in the Byzantine lecture, note that these are starting off at the same point. So kind of map out that timeline and see where they go and how we get from point A to point B and how you can see them interacting with one another. Um, so, with that, have a great rest of your day and good luck with the rest of your module.